Previously on CivicSciTV Africa with Stephanie Okeyo.
Where do you see the roots of podcast in 5 years to come?
Love this question. It's my favorite. I always say that I want to be the Oprah of science, and I'm going to say that and keep saying it until it happens, and people will take these links and say she said it. So yeah, definitely I want to create this premium platform of Africans in STEM globally. Want it to be on demand and live, because I think these types of conversations should be readily and accessibly available. So that's sort of where we see it in terms of the visual content.
Welcome to the Civic Science Africa show. Today we are joined by Dr. Tasha Koch. She's a molecular microbiologist by training and the co-founder of Woza, an NGO based in Cape Town, South Africa, that operates at the intersection of public engagement, youth education, advocacy, and skill development. Tasha is interested in developing impact assessment models for public engagement that are relevant to local context and how the social determinants of health influence the uptake of biomedical interventions. Welcome, Tasha.
Hi, Steph. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you in this conversation. It's really exciting.
So, Tasha, your journey is interesting, and we're going to backtrack a little bit. How did you move from the research space or academia to public engagement and working with communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So my PhD was a very lab-based molecular PhD studying tuberculosis at the University of Cape Town. And as some of your listeners and viewers may or may not know, TB is a really big disease in South Africa and is the biggest killer of South Africans. And I was doing this PhD in the lab, and I was spending these long hours in the lab trying to make mutants. And I realized that I had never actually met anyone who had TB. And that shows two things. The one is that in South Africa, TB is a disease of inequality. And the second was that there were no real avenues at that time for postgrad students who were doing molecular lab-based PhDs to engage with people who were affected by the diseases that they were studying. And, I spoke to some of my friends and colleagues, and we all felt the same way, that we wanted to use the knowledge we had and we were gaining through our postgrad studies to engage with people who are affected by the diseases. And some of the sort of starting of Woza is also very being at the right place at the right time and organic. So at that time, I planned a health workshop with some of my colleagues from UCT, fellow postgrad students. And at the same time, I informally met an artist and South African artist, and I was telling him about all of this. And I said, we're going to have this health workshop. Can you come and film my scientists giving our presentations about TB? And the artist said to me, you know what, Tasha, that will be really boring. Why don't we rather make a documentary about what young people in a place like Khayelitsha, which is a township just outside of Cape Town, that has a very high burden of TB. What do young people there feel, and what are their experiences of TB? That was in 2013, and we did that. It was only going to be that project, and it was really driven by interest from everyone involved. There was no funding or no real funding. I mean, our lab supported us with the costs we needed to do it, but we didn't have to put any applications in or anything. But we all enjoyed the work so much, and our project partners in Khayelitsha enjoyed the work, that in the next year we applied for a Wellcome Trust International Engagement Award. That was our first grant, and that really seeded us and allowed us to grow over the years. And the next real milestone was getting funding from Wellcome to establish an independent not-for-profit, and that's where we really became a public engagement organization. And I changed focus from research to working full-time in public engagement.
And
I hope yeah.
That actually has completely answered the question. But what mindset transition did you have to make from coming from the academic space to now working with communities?
Also a really excellent question. It came naturally to me. I think I was always meant to be working with communities rather than working in the lab. I was never good in the lab. I'm very clumsy. And I'm also it's not a good characteristic to be in the lab. I'm also very impatient. And so while I really highly respect and see the value of knowledge generation in the lab, I like to see immediate impact. And so I really loved working with communities, and it came very naturally. I think what I really had to learn working with communities and working with people from different disciplines to implement the work is that sometimes when we say certain things, even though it's the same word, we mean different things. So when we say knowledge, what do we mean? When we say research, someone from the arts might mean research in a very different way to someone who's a molecular biologist. And really learning to step back and say, okay, what I understand by something is not what someone else understands. So a word that we've been talking a lot about with collaborators is epistemic humility, and understanding that everyone's knowledge is worth something, and valuing all types of knowledge as equal, is something that I always sort of felt, but learning to put that into words and practice it every day, I think was really important. And then also the other thing is, you know, when you're in the lab and you're doing formal research, like in the lab, it's very pre-planned and you have a protocol, and that's really important for scientific research. But community work is responsive, and sometimes things don't work out on the day, and you have to quickly change the way you're doing something, or and being really able to do that and adapt has been really useful. And I think it's a great skill that I've gained, and will be useful for the rest of my life. So I feel very grateful that I've had that opportunity.
And why first of all the name Woza? What does Woza mean? It's an interesting name.
Yes. So like I said, when we first started this work, we never set out to open an organization. It was always like a passion-driven project. And so when we did our first project, we needed the people that were going to be on film and that we were working with, the young people, to sign consent forms. And basically, we needed a name for the projects on our consent forms. And it was as an anagram of the people's names who started the project. So it's Ed, who's the artist, Herman, who was another artist, Warner, who was my PhD supervisor and is a founding board member of Woza because he supported our work so much, Olivia, who was a PhD student at the time with us, Zanele, who was also a PhD student, and then my formal first name is Anastasia, and that made Woza. And that very, very loosely translates to "Hey, come with us" in several South African languages. So Ed always jokes and he says if he had had more time, he wouldn't, if he knew we were going to carry on, he would never have chosen such a cheesy name.
But it's easy to remember.
Yes,
especially in any African language. I think the Woza, it's something also we use, so it actually is working. And speaking of languages, South Africa has 12 official languages, so you work in a very multicultural landscape. And language has been one key area that we've looked at in this program. So how has it been for you and your team working within a country that has 12 official languages, and some even maybe we do not know?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So our work in South Africa is focused, most of our work is focused in an area called Khayelitsha, which, as I said, is a township. It's the largest township in Cape Town. And the language that's spoken by most people there is isiXhosa. And so we will often translate our scientific presentations into Xhosa so that it's relevant to the people that we work with, and so that people can identify with the concepts, because as we know, people often feel more comfortable thinking and engaging in home languages. And so we've done quite a bit of work on that. So our team at Woza are all home language speakers of Xhosa, so we can do that translation really easily. All our films are also in local languages and we translate to English. So that also, I think, is really important for the co-creation process and allowing people to tell their own stories, because it's in languages that people are comfortable with and can express themselves in. On the other hand, Some of our presentations and workshops we still do in English. And the reason for that is that we work with an organization in Khayelitsha called Ekamva Youth. And what their mandate is to improve post-school opportunities for the learners that they work with. And they have asked to try and keep English because they realize that in the post-school environment, it's really important that the learners are able to also converse in English. So we follow that guidance from them. And so we have a like a balance. I think the really complicated scientific terminology should be translated. But then our sort of talking and general day-to-day is sometimes in English as well. Yeah.
And in terms of terminology translation, particularly for scientific terms, has that been tricky for you, or what has been your experience so far when it comes to scientific terms?
So sometimes it's tricky. We haven't yet found a term that is not translatable. There's always a way of explaining it. The other thing that's quite interesting is that, and that's because so much of our team are home language Xhosa speakers and also work with us. But what's interesting about that, Steph, is that sometimes it doesn't have to be a direct translation. And sometimes you lose the meaning of something when you try to directly translate it, because we know that languages, people have different ways of expressing things. And so we work quite hard to make sure that we maintain the original meaning of what someone means in a film when we translate from Xhosa to English. But we also try to make sure that the scientific concepts that we translate also retain the meaning of the scientific concept. So there hasn't been a time where I've been like, there's not a translation for this, or not, at least not one that I can remember. Yeah.
And you guys have done this over now 10 years. So that's a good
Yeah.
sign. And you spoke of films. What has tapping into creative workshops given you as an organization when you're trying to engage in this health discussions, interventions that will not have traditionally gained in other types of engagement styles?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question. I think storytelling is really powerful. And then it becomes even more powerful when you create a mechanism and a platform and a system where people can tell their own stories. So our films are all made by the young people that we work with, and we're very firm on creating a space for young people to tell the story from start to end so that it's their own stories. And I think that's really powerful because when you then use that in a screening about a particular healthcare issue, be it TB, be it diabetes, be it cancer, when people see people that look like them reflected on the screen and talking about issues that resonate with them, it makes people feel very comfortable then to discuss and to have dialogue. And I think that's really, really, really powerful. It's kind of like the name Woza. Yes, it's cheesy, etc., but there's a story behind it as well, which is always helps people identify.
And because you've worked in both worlds, in the research space, in the community space, what do you think is the challenge of bringing in community engagement into the active research environment?
So I've thought about this a lot. I think there's a couple of challenges. There's this question of epistemic humility and knowledge hierarchies, and I think often and sometimes it's unintentional, but scientists think that their knowledge and their way of constructing knowledge is the only way. And I think that we need to be open to different forms of knowledge. So lived experience for me is a form of knowledge and a very valuable form of knowledge. And I think if we could have more acknowledgements of that, it would be really important. I think, again, it goes back to different ways of thinking about things and using different words to describe different things and being able to learn to communicate effectively across disciplines and backgrounds. Two other things. The one is that I think researchers are often very pressed for time. And so there isn't a lot of time for, researchers, especially young researchers. Well, I suppose across the board, there's a lot of pressure to raise funds, to produce data, to write papers, and then carving out time for community engagement and to do it really well is quite a challenge. And there isn't a lot of guidance out there for people. So I think that's a challenge. And then I think something we have to acknowledge is sort of power differentials. If the researchers are coming with the resources to do the community engagement, there's going to be an inherent power differential around that, especially if the researchers are working with people from underserved communities, and I think those expectations and hierarchy should be spoken about upfront so that expectations for the work are very clear. And so those are the things that I've seen people struggle with over the course of sort of being around and doing this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. And when we were talking about your transition, you really spoke of, first of all, the first project you ever did was never applied for any funding. It was more passion driven. And then you got the Wellcome Trust that actually seeded a Woza. For people starting in this, and it's a conversation that most science engagers, science communicators, public engagement practitioners speak about, how funding is integral in their work. What has been your experience so far with your partners and other stakeholders, and advice that you have for people tapping into this space?
Yeah, that's also a really good question, Steph. So I think funding is always going to be a challenge, and it's always going to be quite competitive, and it's always going to be a stress. So one of the things I stress most about in my job now, as the co-director of Woza, is maintaining funding. I think we're grateful that we were in the right place at the right time, and that Wellcome liked the ideas that we were writing, and were willing to take a chance on us. But it would have been much more difficult to do our work if Wellcome hadn't, because it needs funding. And we've also been lucky with Wellcome as a partner, which I think is a testament to them, that they've funded us, but they've also given us a lot of advice around our work, which has strengthened our work. The things that we've started doing to try and generate funding from other sources is obviously targets other funders. We do some earned income work. So that's like if a research group wants to do some engagements around TB, then maybe they ask us to advise or to implement a project for them. So to try and leverage that. And then also to try and combine community and public engagement and science communication with other issues that might be relevant to other funders. So is there stuff in human rights or social justice or democracy where you can use the skills that you've learned in community and public engagements and apply them to other issues as well, to try and target sort of funders that may not traditionally fund community and public engagement. But our collaborations have been very key for us in that way. But it's always a stress. I still don't feel comfortable that we have enough fun. It's like, you're always like, okay, keep going on the applications. It's very stressful. Yeah.
And as we wrap up, what's next for Woza? Where do you yeah.
So we talk about, people ask us about scale quite a lot, and can we, we're very focused in a particular part of Cape Town. In sort of most of our work is in Khayelitsha. We've expanded to Masiphumelele, which is another township in Cape Town, and that's fine. What we've recently done is we ran a project, actually we just got back a few weeks ago, in an area of South Africa, province called the Eastern Cape, in a particular area close to a place called Elliotdale, with an organization called the Bulungula Incubator. This is a much more remote and rural part of South Africa, but actually very linked to Khayelitsha, because our socio-political history is that there was a lot of migrant labor that came from the Eastern Cape into Khayelitsha. So in terms of thinking about expanding our work, how does our work translate in a more remote and rural area? How do people's health challenges look different in places like that? How do we adapt and optimize our work for those areas? And so I think that's what we'll be looking at next year, and then building some climate and health work, which we've already started doing this year, and then the TB vaccine that's coming out. I think there will be opportunity to do community engagement work in a few years. So really looking at how we develop the infrastructure for that. And then the last point is making sure that we have good training and skills development of people, so that there's succession planning. I would like to be able to hand over a Woza to the next generation at some point. So really focusing on being intentional about that.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Always a pleasure to learn what a Woza is all about and up to. And you've been a great pioneer in terms of engagement work within actually not only Southern Africa, but within Africa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Steph. It's been so lovely to chat to you.